Pick that up, sweetheart. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 48 minutes before a massive armed man walked into his ICU and changed everything. Cedar Creek Medical's fluorescent lights hum over sterile white tile as Brooke Sullivan moves through the ICU with invisible precision. Her hands are steady on charts. Her voice is low with patience, information only, no excess words, no warmth that isn't necessary. She's been here 1 week. The locker in the break room holds her life compressed into a narrow metal box, 3 pairs of scrubs, a coffee mug no one has ever seen her use, and tucked behind everything, wrapped in cloth that's been folded the same way for 18 months, a pair of worn combat boots. The leather is cracked at the seams. The sole of the left boot shows a scuff pattern from running on black sand. She doesn't socialize. Doesn't explain her gaps. When someone asks where she worked before, she says around and turns back to her patient. Her forearms show faint scars when she rolls her sleeves to wash her hands. Symmetrical scars. Surgical precision to them. Old. The kind of marks that don't come from a single event but from decisions made repeatedly under conditions most people can't imagine. She covers them before she leaves the break room. Every time. Wrist to elbow, long sleeves pulled down, the fabric sitting 3 inches below her cuff. Dr. Whitfield notices on day 3. He watches her review the ICU's equipment logs at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, her eyes tracking columns of numbers with a focus that makes him uneasy. She's checking billing codes against actual procedures. Comparing dosages against inventory. Her chart notes are unusually detailed, procedure times logged to the minute, equipment deployed noted by serial number, medication administration times that match exactly with the electronic records. Most nurses chart the essentials. Brooke charts everything. Whitfield has spent 7 years inflating equipment costs and billing for procedures that happened but with prices that didn't match reality. Not theft, exactly, not the way his attorney has explained it. Creative accounting. Margin optimization. Everyone does it. The problem is that Brooke's meticulous work creates a paper trail that contradicts his. Where he's logged a $4,200 charge for a single-use monitoring array, her notes show the equipment was reused on 3 patients that shift. Where he's billed for a procedure that took 45 minutes, her timestamps show it took 12. On day 4, he asks her where she worked before Cedar Creek. She's standing at the medication dispensary, waiting for the automated cabinet to unlock. She doesn't turn around. Around, she says. That's not an answer. It's the one I'm giving. She speaks the way someone speaks who has learned that extra words are a liability. The way someone speaks who has trained their voice to carry only information, the way a radio carries only signal. Her jaw doesn't move when she talks. Her mouth barely opens. Whitfield has been a surgeon for 23 years. He knows how to read people the way he reads anatomy, looking for weakness, for leverage, for the soft places where pressure can be applied. This woman has no soft places. Not visible ones. But everyone has something. Everyone needs something. Everyone breaks. I'll need your employment history, he says. You have it. The gaps. Personal. She takes the medications from the cabinet and leaves. Whitfield stands there, holding his pharmacy printout, and for the first time in a long time, he feels like someone is looking at him and seeing through him instead of seeing him at all. That night he reviews her file. Brooke Sullivan. 38 years old. No criminal record. No medical discipline. No lawsuits. 3 references that check out, previous supervisors who say she's efficient, quiet, reliable. No personal social media. No digital footprint beyond employment records and a driver's license. It's like someone took a person and erased them, then put them back wearing a different face. There are gaps in her work history. 5 years missing between 2010 and 2015. Another gap from 2017 to 2019. Those aren't vacation years. Those are years you don't account for unless you're being careful. Unless someone asked you to disappear. He makes a call at 1 a.m. His connection on the other end works in background checks and acquisition. I need everything you can find on Brooke Sullivan, Whitfield says. And I need to know if there are records I shouldn't be able to access. The classified kind. The response takes 48 hours. What comes back is nothing. Not a lack of information, nothing. No social security number that traces far enough. No military service records. No passport. It's like she exists only from the moment she appeared at Cedar Creek Medical. Which means she existed very much before that, in places that don't show up in ordinary databases. Whitfield understands this language. He's never served, but he's treated enough military personnel to know what a ghost looks like. What a ghost walks like. How a ghost charts medications. The next morning, he decides to make her visible. He announces it in the staff lounge at 7:14 a.m., loud enough for 6 people to hear. Brooke is not among them. I'm making a bet, Whitfield says. He pulls out his wallet, counts out $50 in cash and leaves it on the table near the coffee maker. $50 says our new nurse quits before the end of the month. Anyone want to take it? Nobody does. At 11:24 a.m., Brooke carries her lunch tray to a table in the corner of the cafeteria. Turkey sandwich, side salad, ginger ale. She's just sat down when Whitfield appears, his tray in both hands, and he walks directly past her table. His left hip catches the edge of her tray. It's not accidental. The angle is too precise. The speed is too controlled. The tray tips. Her lunch scatters across the tile floor, letters spinning, the sandwich landing butter side down, the glass of ginger ale shattering on impact, the liquid spreading across the tiles like something organic waking up. For exactly 1 second, the room stops. Everyone is watching. Brooke looks at the floor, then at Whitfield. She doesn't look shocked. She doesn't look angry. She looks at him the way someone looks at a problem they're about to solve. When she stands slowly. She picks up her plate. Then she picks up the napkins from the dispenser and kneels down to clean what's on the floor. Her movements are economical. Efficient. She's done this before, not cleaning up spilled food, but managing chaos with absolute focus. A man sits 2 tables away and tries not to stare. Another nurse pretends to check her phone. Whitfield watches her for exactly 4 seconds, then turns and walks back toward the surgery wing, his tray still full, his point made. When Brooke finishes cleaning, she throws everything away and walks to the staff refrigerator. She pulls out a pre-made protein container, chicken, rice, steamed vegetables, that she must have brought from home. She sits back down. She eats. Her hands don't shake. Her jaw doesn't clench more than once, briefly. Her breathing doesn't change. She finishes every bite. When she's done, she returns her container to the refrigerator and clocks back in for the afternoon shift at exactly 12:37 p.m. Whitfield watches this from the window of the surgery wing. He's looking for a crack. Doesn't find one. 3 days later, he escalates. During patient rounds, she's reviewing a chart for Mr. Castellano in room 7, a post-op cardiac patient recovering from surgery to repair a stenotic valve. Her notes are precise: O2 saturation trending upward, blood pressure stable, medications administered on schedule. Whitfield approaches, stands directly over her, and drops his pen. Not accidentally. It lands on the chart she's holding. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he says. The tone is something between a command and an insult. The room goes quiet. 2 residents pretend to review vitals. A respiratory technician suddenly needs to check something in the medication dispensary. Brooke doesn't look up from the chart. She sets it down carefully on the counter. She picks up his pen. She sets it on the desk next to him. She retrieves her chart. She continues her work. She's moved past the moment before Whitfield has even registered that she isn't going to cry, isn't going to respond, isn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break under social pressure the way civilians break. The way he expects people to break. Problem? Whitfield asks, wanting her to speak, needing her to say something that proves she's affected. Brooke doesn't look at him. No, she says. Then, Mr. Castellano's diuretic should increase. His lungs sound slightly congested. I'll document it. She's speaking as if he isn't there. Speaking to the chart, to the patient, to the work. Speaking past him like he's already irrelevant. Whitfield feels his jaw tighten. The trembling isn't in her hands. It's in the air between them, invisible, the kind of pressure that builds before something breaks. He turns and walks away. That evening, Brooke sits on the floor of her apartment with the combat boots in her lap. The place is sparse, a bed she doesn't seem to sleep in, a kitchen she doesn't cook in, a living room with a single chair facing a wall. The boots are worn. The left one has a scuff from running on black sand. The right one has a gouge on the heel, the kind you get from rappelling lines catching. She holds them in the dark, just holds them, the leather dry and cracking in her hands. She remembers what these boots walked through. She remembers who was wearing them. She remembers the weight of decisions and the precise moment when she stopped being Brooke Sullivan and became something else, something nameless, something that lived in the space between civilian and ghost. She remembers Bagram. She remembers the team. She remembers the order that came down from command: you're being reassigned to civilian life. Your service is being reclassified. Your record is being sealed. You are no longer Master Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan. As of 0600 hours, that person no longer exists in any official capacity. Understand? She understood. She'd spent 16 years as Master Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan. She'd led 214 sailors through 3 deployments. She'd lost 8 of them. She'd saved 47 in the field through surgical intervention, emergency cricothyrotomy, direct cardiac massage through open chest, femoral artery clamping with her own hands, and her will keeping people alive until the Black Hawks arrived. She'd earned 2 Purple Hearts, a Silver Star, and honors that would never be recorded. Then one operation went sideways in a way that meant it never happened. One mission that was supposed to stay classified forever. And when the Pentagon decided that she had seen too much, that her record needed to be a ghost story, she walked away from all of it and became a nurse. Now she sits in the dark with the boots and remembers the weight. The next morning, Dr. Whitfield makes another call. He's activated his network, board members who owe him favors, an HR director he's cultivated through golf outings and carefully timed referrals, an outside investigator he's used before to eliminate problems. He's beginning stage 2. Strategic moves. He's going to isolate her. He's going to make her invisible enough that when he fires her, nobody will remember she was there long enough to ask questions. He doesn't know what he's standing next to. Morning rounds at Cedar Creek Medical move with the precision of a surgical clock. Brooke stands at the foot of a patient's bed, her tablet angled toward the attending physician, her voice steady as she recites vitals from the previous 8 hours, oxygen saturation 94%, heart rate stable at 78, blood pressure 110/68. The resident beside her takes notes. Everything is textbook. Everything is perfect. Dr. Whitfield enters from the opposite end of the ICU, his white coat pressed sharp enough to cut, his shoes buffed to a shine that speaks of someone who outsources the details of living to people beneath him. He's been watching her work. That much is obvious from the way his jaw tightens when her charting appears on the shared system, meticulously detailed, time-stamped to the minute, impossible to manipulate or obscure. For days she's been here. For days of perfect documentation. He hasn't slept well since her start date. He approaches the bedside where Brooke is updating the patient's medication administration record. The tablet is in her hands. The room is full of witnesses. And Dr. Whitfield reaches down, grabs the patient's chart from the rolling stand, and hurls it at her feet with the force of someone throwing a punch. The pages scatter across the polished floor. Some slide under the bed. One catches the air current from the ventilation system and drifts like a falling leaf. Whitfield's voice comes out smooth and loud enough for the entire ICU to hear, "Pick that up, sweetheart." Since you're so good at cleaning up messes. The room goes dead silent. The monitor's steady beeping seems to grow louder in the absence of all other sound. A nurse at the supply station stops moving. The resident's pen stops mid-sentence. Everyone waits for the new girl to break. Everyone waits to see if Dr. Whitfield has finally found her threshold. Brooke's jaw clenches. Once. Briefly. Like a pressure valve opening just enough to prevent rupture. That's all. Her hands that have held life and death in equal measure, hands that have performed emergency cricothyrotomy through the cricothyroid membrane when a soldier's airway collapsed under fire, hands that know the exact pressure required to position a chest tube without perforating a lung, don't tremble. Don't shake. Don't waver. She sets her tablet on the bedside table with care. The movement is economical. Precise. Military in its efficiency. She kneels and begins gathering the scattered pages. One by one. Her breathing is controlled. Her face is a mask, not angry, not hurt, not even particularly present. It's the face of someone who has learned that composure is its own form of resistance. The resident who had been writing glances away, uncomfortable with the nakedness of the humiliation. Whitfield watches her, waiting for something, a tremor, a sharp word, a crack in that infuriating stillness. It doesn't come. When Brooke rises, holding the reassembled chart, every page in order, she opens it and continues her report on the patient's vitals as if Whitfield hasn't spoken at all. Urine output decreased slightly overnight. I've documented the trend on page 4. Recommend checking creatinine levels at next drawer. Medications administered on schedule. No adverse events. Her voice carries the weight of competence. It's not aggressive. It's not defensive. It's simply fact, delivered with the kind of clarity that comes from knowing exactly what matters and what doesn't. Whitfield's smile fades. He hadn't expected her to continue. He'd expected her to leave. To cry. To defend herself. To give him something to work with. Instead, she's made him invisible, and there's something about being rendered invisible that infuriates people far more than anger ever could. But the real damage starts the next morning. Brooke arrives at 6:50 a.m. for her shift briefing, 30 minutes before her shift officially begins, a habit from 18 years of military discipline, where punctuality wasn't a suggestion but a survival mechanism. The assignment board lists her name with 4 patient rooms. She's been handling 2. The other 2 are new additions, a post-operative open cardiac massage case, direct surgical intervention through the sternum, high acuity, demanding constant monitoring, and a trauma admission with complicated wound management that will require precise charting of tissue layers and infection protocols. These aren't mistakes. These are assignments designed with intention. These are assignments meant to test whether she'll crack under workload, miss something, falsify documentation out of desperation. The charge nurse, Margaret, avoids her eyes when Brooke asks about the additions. Whitfield's orders. You're the newest on staff. Need to round you out. The lie is so transparent it's almost respectful. Margaret used to be the one Whitfield favored. She knows exactly what he's doing. She also knows that contradicting him costs you your schedule, your preferred patient assignments, your professional reputation in ways that don't show up on paper. Brooke nods once and heads to the supply closet to prepare her medication carts. But when she scans the requisition for the trauma case, sterile wound vacs, specialty dressing materials, the specific saline concentrations required for post-blast trauma, she finds the access locked. She's been restricted. Whitfield has implemented a new protocol requiring supervisor approval for any equipment request that exceeds the standard ICU inventory. In practice, this means every single dressing, every specialized tool, every piece of equipment that makes the difference between good care and flawless care now requires his approval. And he's been scheduled nowhere near the ICU this morning. She submits the request anyway. Detailed. Professional. Timestamped at 6:58 a.m. By 7:30, when shift starts and she's supposed to be performing her first round on the new patients, the request hasn't been approved. She walks to the nurse's station and calls the surgical floor. He's there, she's told. Finishing morning rounds. She leaves a message. Professional. Urgent but not panicked. Dr. Whitfield, trauma for requires approval on equipment requisition. Standing by for clearance. 7:45. Still no approval. The trauma patient is becoming unstable. Early signs of infection in the wound. She needs the equipment. She picks up the phone again and calls the surgical ward directly. This time Whitfield answers. His voice comes through the line like a snake moving through dry grass. You'll wait for proper approval channels, Sullivan. We can't have you ordering things willy-nilly. Liability issues. She hangs up without responding. She documents the time of the call, the reason for the request, and the denial. Everything is visible. Everything is on the record. And everything is designed to slow her down. But what Whitfield doesn't understand is that Brooke wasn't trained in an environment where paperwork moved fast or systems functioned smoothly. She was trained in places where supplies took days to arrive, where you improvised, where the difference between a soldier living and dying often came down to what you could do with what you had right in front of you. She improvises. She uses standard dressings in configurations designed for the specific trauma profile. She manually monitors the wound site with the frequency that the automated systems would have handled. She documents everything in a way that will survive any audit, any review, any examination of her decision-making. It takes longer. It requires more of her. But it's flawless. By noon, the trauma patient is stable. By end of shift, the wound is clean and infection is controlled. The cardiac case doesn't fare well. Not because of care, but because Whitfield also implements new charting protocols that week, a mandatory template system that requires 17 separate documentation steps for every medication administration, every vital sign change, every procedural intervention. It's ostensibly designed for quality assurance. In reality, it adds 45 minutes per shift of pure documentation burden. The system is clunky. It's designed to create friction between the nursing staff, because the template requirements are so demanding that coordinating care becomes nearly impossible. A nurse can't simply hand off information anymore. Everything has to be entered into a template. Approved by the template system. Cross-referenced. And anything that doesn't fit the template's parameters gets flagged as an anomaly. Brooke adapts. She develops a workflow that accounts for the delays. She learns the system's quirks. She finds the workarounds that don't violate protocol but save 15 minutes per patient. She stays late to complete documentation every single night, hours of her own time spent making sure that the charting is not just compliant but perfect. Her jaw clenches. Her hands stay steady. The mask never slips in the ICU. It's only at night, alone in her apartment, that the tension finds its way out. She comes home after 12-hour shifts that have consumed 13 hours of her day, the extra hour spent on charting in the quiet after the day staff leaves. She sets down her keys. She removes her shoes. She walks to the bedroom closet and pulls out the box from the back, the one hidden behind her winter clothes. Inside, a pair of combat boots. Not regulation. Not new. These are the boots she wore in Bagram. Scuffed. Stained with things she stopped trying to clean out 5 years ago. She pulls them out and holds them in the darkness, sitting on the edge of her bed, and for the first time in 4 days, her composure breaks. Her shoulders shake. Tears stream down her face in a silence so complete that the only sound is the rain beginning to hammer the windows outside, each drop like a small percussion instrument playing a chord of exhaustion. Her hands tremble. They shake like they haven't since she was 18 years old and terrified. This is what the mask costs. This is the price of pretending that nothing matters, that no one can touch you, that you can absorb unlimited abuse without it changing something fundamental in your chemistry. But that wasn't the worst part of what Whitfield had set in motion. The worst part was that he'd planned it perfectly. The worst part was that by systematically piling obstacles in her path, he'd created a situation where eventually something would break. And when it did, when she finally made a mistake or lost her temper or showed weakness, he'd be positioned to say he'd seen it coming all along. He'd be positioned to fire her before she could expose the patterns in his billing, before her meticulous documentation could be used against him in any kind of audit. The bet he'd made in the staff lounge, $50 that she'd quit before the month was out, it was always going to be a bet he'd win. Because one way or another, he was going to get her to leave. Or he was going to break her trying. Neither of them knew that in 48 hours, something would walk through the ICU doors that would change everything. Something that would crack open the world he'd constructed and expose it for what it was, not unassailable power, but a house of cards built on the assumption that no one would ever be standing nearby with steady hands and the experience to dismantle it in seconds. Day 9 at Cedar Creek Medical started like any other morning. Brooke pulled her scrubs over the dog tags she no longer wore openly, the metal cold against her ribs, a secret kept by cotton and habit. The ICU hummed with its usual rhythm, ventilators wheezed their mechanical breath, monitors beat their steady count of hearts still beating, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. She was moving between rooms when the first alarm sounded. Not a medical alarm. Security. The sound wasn't the three-tone code that meant a rest attempt or combative patient. This was different. This was the full building alert, the kind that made every head in the hallway turn at once. Brooke was in room 8 checking a femoral line when she heard it, and her hand stilled for exactly one breath. 12 years of instinct compressed into a single moment of recognition, something was coming. The elevator doors burst open at the far end of the ICU corridor with the sound of metal slamming against metal. A man emerged. 6'5", maybe 6'6", his frame moving like a walking tank, heavy-muscled and moving with the terrible precision of someone whose nervous system had come uncalibrated from reality. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. His eyes were wide and tracking nothing specific, everything at once. In his right hand, a pistol hung loose at his side like an extension of his own arm. Colonel Hayes, he screamed, and the name echoed down the ICU corridor with the force of a man whose lungs had learned to project across distance, across danger, across time. Colonel Hayes, I know you're here. Every person in the ICU froze. Not the useful kind of frozen, not the focused, tactical kind. The useless kind. The kind where nurses gripped medication dispensers and doctors stopped mid-thought, their brains unable to reconcile the impossible fact that a man with a firearm was now walking through their sterile space like he owned it. A resident near the nursing station took a step backward. Another simply turned and ran toward the back exit, her plastic badge clattering against the wall as she moved. "Where is he?" the man screamed, and his voice cracked with something between rage and desperation. "Where is Colonel Hayes? They said he was here. They said he was here and he could fix it." Brooke was still in room 8, her hand still touching a patient's leg, but her mind had already gone somewhere else. Not backward to Bagram. Forward to the tactical geometry of the ICU. Room 12 was where Colonel Hayes was recovering from vascular surgery. Room 12 was 3 doors down from where this man was standing. Room 12 was directly in his line of sight if he turned left, and he was about to turn left because that's where his eyes were moving and his body was following the ancient logic of threat-seeking behavior. She released her patient's leg with a whisper, "I'll be right back," and stepped into the corridor. The man swung toward her, his eyes landing on the movement, and for one crucial moment he was deciding whether she was a threat or irrelevant. His hand lifted slightly. The pistol rose. Brooke had maybe 3 seconds to change his calculation before his trigger finger decided they were the same thing. She didn't run. She didn't raise her hands. She walked toward him with the kind of slow deliberation that said, "I'm not afraid and I'm not a threat," even though every cell in her body knew exactly how to be both. Her voice, when it came, was pitch low, not quiet, but low, like someone speaking into a radio across open water. "Hey. I know Colonel Hayes. He's in room 12. The man's eyes landed on her face. His jaw clenched. The gun trembled in his hand like it was connected to an electric current running through his entire body. You know him." "Yeah." Brooke's hand stayed visible, palms down, her whole body language a study in non-threat. "He's my son's commanding officer. Charlie Platoon, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. I know exactly who he is." Something in that shifted him. The unit name. The chain of command. The evidence that she was speaking his language, that she was part of the world he came from, even if that world had stopped making sense. His breathing changed, became slightly less ragged. The gun hand dropped an inch. He was supposed to help me," the man said, and his voice cracked like glass under pressure. "He was supposed to fix what they did. What they made us do." "I know," Brooke said. She was maybe 8 feet from him now, her posture open, her face arranged in the expression of someone who understood exactly what he meant, even if the ICU staff frozen behind him thought she was insane. Colonel Hayes is the kind of man who helps people. But he's sleeping right now. He's recovering from surgery. If you come see him like this, if he sees the gun, it's going to hurt him. His blood pressure's already unstable. The man's face contorted. His eyes welled. I don't want to hurt him. I just need him to. I can't do this anymore. I can't." The pistol shook in his hand. He swung it away from her, toward the young male resident who had frozen near the pharmacy station instead of running, the kind of indecision that left him caught between two impulses. The gun rose toward the resident's chest, then kept rising, swinging toward his head like the man was about to make a decision that couldn't be unmade. Brooke moved. There was no moment of hesitation between seeing the threat and acting on it. Her body didn't ask her brain for permission. Muscle memory didn't consult with choice. She was across 8 feet of tile in a trajectory that put her inside his reach, her left hand redirecting his gun hand upward, the wrist turned smooth and efficient, the kind of movement that came from 1,000 repetitions in a gymnasium in Virginia that didn't officially exist. His finger was still tightening on the trigger when she drove her right elbow into his solar plexus with the kind of force that converted all his breath into a gasp and his stability into a sudden absence of it. His leg swept. His body followed gravity. He hit the tile hard enough that the impact should have hurt, should have mattered, but Brooke was already riding him down, her knee between his shoulder blades, her arm locked at an angle that would tear ligaments if he struggled. The gun skittered across the floor like something alive, coming to rest against the base of a medication cart with a sound that made half the frozen staff flinch. For seconds. That's all it took. The man sobbed into the floor, his whole body shaking, and Brooke's voice dropped to something barely audible, words that only he would hear, spoken directly into his ear in a tone that carried the weight of truth spoken between soldiers. "It's over. You're safe now. I've got you. You don't understand," he gasped. "You don't understand what we did. What they made us." "Sanjin Valley," Brooke said quietly. "Helmand Province. July 2009. Operation Enduring Freedom, Task Force 33. I know exactly what they made you do. And I know it wasn't your choice." She shifted her weight slightly, keeping him pinned with perfect control, and whispered something else, a unit designation, a date, a name of someone who hadn't made it home. The man went completely still. He stopped struggling. He nodded into the tile once, a gesture of recognition, and his body went limp with something that wasn't surrender. It was relief. Security arrived 40 seconds later, but by then the situation had already been resolved. The man was restrained, the weapon secured, the resident unharmed. Brooke released him only when the security officers had his arms, and she stood with the kind of smooth fluidity that made it look like she was simply finishing her rounds instead of having just disassembled a 6'5" combat veteran with bare hands and institutional knowledge. She was reaching for a fresh pair of gloves when she felt the weight of observation. Eyes on her. Heavy eyes. The kind of eyes that were trying to recalculate everything they thought they understood. Dr. Whitfield stood at the far end of the ICU, near the nursing station, his face dark with a color that wasn't quite rage and wasn't quite fear. It was something worse, recognition. He had watched her move, and he understood, finally, that he'd made a calculation error. That the person he'd been systematically humiliating had been holding something back. Something precise. Something trained. Something that had just saved his hospital from a headline that would have destroyed him. And instead of gratitude, his expression arranged itself into something that looked like threat assessment. Within an hour, he would be on the phone. The board members who owed him favors would hear his voice, calm and purposeful. The HR director he'd cultivated through 3 years of expensive dinners would receive his email request. The outside investigator he'd used before, the one who specialized in generating complaints that stuck, would be activated. "I need her gone," he would say quietly. "Today. I don't care how." But right now, in the immediate aftermath, Brooke walked toward room 12 to check on Colonel Hayes, completely unaware that the clock had just started ticking. Completely unaware that the moment she'd moved to save a stranger's life, she'd set in motion the machinery of her own destruction. The man she'd just subdued was being walked to a holding area by security. The resident she'd saved was probably calling his mother. And somewhere in the office that bore Whitfield's name, a calculation was being made, not about her heroism, but about her liability. She knew none of this yet. She was still just a nurse checking vitals, her hand steady, her pulse normal, moving through the ICU like she belonged there. But the walls were beginning to close. The ground was beginning to shift. And Dr. Whitfield was about to remind her that in hospitals, like in war, the person with the most to lose is often the most dangerous. The pistol swung toward the young resident's head like a pendulum ticking toward oblivion. Time didn't slow, it crystallized. The shooter's finger was already flexing on the trigger. 3 feet away. Closing. Brooke moved. Not fast. Precise. Her body remembered things her mind had been forced to forget, the weight distribution of a human spine, the pressure points that meant surrender, the mathematics of violence reduced to 4 clean seconds. 1. Her left hand intercepted the wrist. 2. Her right shoulder rotated through his center line, leveraging 320 pounds of rage into a fulcrum. 3. The gun fell, a metallic whisper against linoleum. 4. He hit the floor hard enough to drive the air from his lungs, her knee pinning his spine at T4, his arm locked in an angle that telegraphed one message: don't move, or break. The room exhaled. Doctors and nurses who had frozen in place now moved like sleepers waking, rushing to help, to secure the weapon, to check on the resident who was still standing, still breathing, still alive because someone in scrubs with trembling hands that weren't trembling at all had understood the language of violence well enough to speak it fluently and then stop. Dr. Whitfield watched from behind the nurse's station, his face darkening like a bruise spreading beneath skin. He didn't move. He didn't help. He simply stood there, watching Brooke Sullivan become something he hadn't bargained for, something that couldn't be humiliated or ground down or dismissed as just a nurse. She was something else entirely. Something dangerous. Something that had to be eliminated. Within 60 minutes, his phone was in his hands. The network activated like synapses firing in a predator's brain. Board members who owed him favors, men he'd invited to his lake house, women whose sons he'd hired through hospital connections, colleagues whose discretion he'd purchased over years of careful alliance building. An HR director he'd cultivated over 4 years of monthly lunches and strategic vulnerability. An outside investigator he'd used before, a man who understood that documentation could be shaped like clay, that records could tell whatever story the person holding the pen wanted them to tell. The machinery of institutional power ground into motion. By the next morning at 8 o'clock, Brooke was sitting across from the HR director in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness of enclosed spaces where bad news was routinely delivered. The walls were a color designed not to offend anyone, which meant they offended everyone. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. Dr. Whitfield sat beside the director, his face arranged in an expression of deep professional concern. He'd practiced this look in the mirror. It was the face of a man gravely disappointed, a man forced to report a truth he wished wasn't true. The suspension papers slid across the table like an accusation. Excessive force, the HR director read, her voice careful and neutral. Undisclosed background. Violation of protocol. Brooke's jaw flexed once. She'd learned to read rooms the way other people read books. This room was already written. Already decided. The patient was armed, she said quietly. The situation was de-escalated safely. No one was injured. That's not what the documentation shows, Whitfield said, and his voice was smooth as oil. According to the incident report, you escalated the situation significantly. You engaged a combative psychiatric patient without waiting for security or psychiatric evaluation. You applied a restraint that could have caused spinal injury. He tapped a folder, pages of medical terminology arranged to create a narrative of negligence. We've contacted your previous employers for references. He paused. The pause was strategic. It hung in the air like a blade suspended. None of them have records of your service, Ms. Sullivan. Brooke's face went white. Not from fear. She'd learned fear at 23 years old in a compound outside Bagram and had methodically taught herself to recognize it as information, not truth. This was something different. This was a door slamming on 17 years of existence, 18 years of a life that officially never happened. The military couldn't defend her. Master Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan was a ghost in the system, her records classified and sealed, her orders clear from the moment they'd put her on the transport out of Afghanistan, disappear and never surface. Don't make waves. Don't contact your unit. Don't confirm your service to anyone. The operation in Bagram was buried deep enough that even speaking its name could trigger federal investigation. She opened her mouth. Closed it. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be a lie or a violation of security protocols written in blood and signatures that had already cost her everything once. You're suspended pending full investigation, the director said, sliding another document forward. 2 weeks paid leave while we complete our review. But there was no review. 2 days later, Brooke received her termination letter delivered to her home address by certified mail, a document that read like a medical report on a patient no one would miss. Dangerous. Unstable. Liability. Recommendation for immediate discharge and notation in her permanent record. Dr. Whitfield smiled as she cleared out her locker that afternoon, her movements mechanical and precise. She folded her extra scrubs. She placed her stethoscope in her bag. She reached to the back of the locker where she kept the worn combat boots, faded leather, and salt-stained laces, and slipped them into a plastic bag without looking at them directly. Acknowledging them would have meant something she couldn't afford to acknowledge. The drive home took 17 minutes. Rain had begun to fall sometime in the last hour, the kind of Portland rain that wasn't dramatic or angry, just persistent and cold, the kind that washed everything into a slow, grey blur. She gripped the steering wheel at 10 and 2, the way she'd been trained, and tried to think about nothing at all. Her 16-year-old son, Marcus, was home when she arrived, which was wrong. It was 3:15 on a Tuesday afternoon. He should have been at school. Instead, he was sitting at the kitchen table doing something on his laptop when she walked through the door, still in her scrubs, carrying a locker's worth of 16 months of employment in a canvas bag. He looked up. He saw her face. Something in his expression shifted from casual teenage distraction to something sharper, something that recognized the texture of bad news before the words had even been formed. He'd learned to read her the way she'd learned to read rooms. "Mom? Why are you home early?" She couldn't answer. If she opened her mouth, the sound that came out wouldn't be words. It would be something older and rawer, something that had been waiting in her chest since the moment Whitfield had activated his network and decided that Master Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan was a problem that needed to be solved. The termination letter was on the kitchen counter, still in its envelope. Marcus saw it. His eyes moved from the envelope to her face and then back again, the 3 points of a triangle that he was learning to complete on his own. "Mom, what happened?" She sat down at the table, the same table where she'd held her combat boots 3 weeks ago in the dark of her apartment, remembering who she used to be. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. But her eyes had betrayed her, and tears were streaming down her face in a way that made her look like someone's mother instead of someone's soldier. "I can't explain," she said, and her voice was exactly the right volume and tone, but the words themselves were breaking. "I'm not allowed to explain." Marcus stared at her. Confusion shifted across his face like weather, and then something else moved in behind it, a determination that looked terrifyingly similar to the determination that lived in his mother's eyes on days when she'd forgotten to keep the mask in place. "We'll fix this," he said simply. "Whatever this is. We'll fix it." But Brooke knew that some things couldn't be fixed. Some things could only be survived or revealed or left behind. And in that moment, with rain hammering the kitchen windows and her hand steady even as tears fell, she didn't know which one this was going to be. 3 days later, the hospital administrator's emergency board meeting had convened in the mahogany conference room on the 7th floor, the kind of space where decisions about people's careers were made in climate-controlled silence. The long table gleamed under recessed lighting. 6 board members sat rigid in their leather chairs, Dr. Whitfield positioned at the head like a man who'd won something. Then the doors opened. Brooke's son walked in carrying a wooden box. He was 16, wearing his rock dress uniform, the creases sharp enough to cut. His jaw was set. He was shaking. The room turned. Whitfield's face darkened the moment he saw the uniform. The boy set the box on the table in front of the board chairman and his voice broke as the first words left his mouth. "Mom, they need to see these." He opened the box. Inside, arranged on navy blue velvet, lay medals. Bronze ribbon with an oak leaf cluster. Silver star on a broader ribbon. 2 purple hearts, the profile of Washington facing left, catching the light. Beneath them, discharge papers sealed with military stamps, a security clearance certification marked special access required, and a letter of commendation on Pentagon letterhead. The room went completely silent. One of the board members leaned forward, unable to stop herself. Whitfield stood up. "This is completely." A veteran security guard who'd worked Cedar Creek for 22 years stepped forward. His name was Marcus Chen. He'd served in the 75th Ranger Regiment from 1998 to 2004. He picked up the discharge papers with hands that had learned respect a long time ago, and he read the rank aloud in a voice that carried the weight of every ceremony he'd ever attended. "Master Chief Petty Officer." The words hung in the air like the moment before a judge's gavel falls. The board chairman's face went white. Whitfield's hands were gripping the edge of the table. The second board member pulled out her phone and started typing something frantic. Brooke's son stood absolutely still beside the box, watching Whitfield's face decompose in real time. The doors opened again. A nurse wheeled Colonel James Hayes into the room. He was still pale from his surgery, still moving like a man rebuilding himself piece by piece, but his presence commanded the space the moment he entered. His uniform was dress blues. His insignia caught the light. Everyone in the room except Whitfield recognized what they were looking at. Hayes wheeled himself forward slightly and his voice came out hoarse, damaged by weeks of recovery, but clear. "I was assigned to Bagram in 2012. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. My unit was pinned down in the Jolin district after an IED detonation. 3 of my men were injured. Ammunition was low. We were taking fire from 3 positions, and we had no support available for another 4 hours." He stopped, and the silence was so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Master Chief Sullivan was our forward observer that day. She was attached to my unit for one operation only. One operation. Whitfield sat back down very slowly. She called in the strike coordinates under heavy fire. She moved through that compound with her team, JSOC, not Standard Marine Corps, and she extracted my 2 most critical casualties while their unit provided covering fire. One of those wounded men was Sergeant Robert Macon. He has a 7-year-old daughter now. He went to college on the GI Bill. He's alive because Brooke Sullivan moved through an active firefight and carried him out on her back. Hayes's voice cracked. "I took a round meant for a junior officer. The bullet went through my abdomen." Master Chief Sullivan performed emergency resuscitation, direct cardiac massage through an open chest in a field environment with no working ventilation. She kept me alive for 43 minutes until medevac. That's 43 minutes of her hands pushing into my chest cavity while rounds were still coming down. He picked up one of the Purple Hearts. The medal caught the light and threw it back into Whitfield's eyes. She earned 2 of these. She didn't talk about it. She came here and she worked. She pushed a med cart and charted vitals, and I would bet my commission she never once told anyone what she'd done, because that's the kind of person she is. And your hospital just destroyed her career because she stopped a man with a loaded weapon from shooting someone in this building. The silence after that wasn't empty. It was full. It was the kind of silence that happens when power suddenly redistributes itself across a room. Then the door opened a 3rd time, and 2 federal agents walked in. They were wearing blue jackets with FBI in white across the chest. The older one, a woman with gray threading through her hair and the posture of someone who'd spent 20 years in federal law enforcement, placed a folder on the table with enough force to make the medals jump slightly. Dr. Jonathan Whitfield. She didn't ask. She stated, "You're under federal investigation for healthcare fraud, equipment cost inflation, and falsification of medical records spanning the last 7 years. We have warrants for your office, your home, and your personal financial records." Whitfield stood up. "I demand to speak to my attorney." "You can speak to your attorney." The second agent, younger, with a face that looked carved from ironwood, nodded at his colleague. "After you listen. Your attempt to alter the military service records of Master Chief Petty Officer Sullivan triggered an alert in the federal database. That alert was escalated to NCIS. They contacted us. We found that you'd been systematically overbilling for equipment, recruiting suppliers who would split inflated costs with you, and billing for procedures that were never performed. One of your conspirators is already cooperating. The equipment supplier you worked with from 2016 to 2023, Precision Medical Solutions, has provided documentation of 847 fraudulent invoices totaling $2.3 million. They're testifying against you. Whitfield's face had gone the color of old concrete. You submitted false documentation to have Master Chief Sullivan terminated specifically because her charting practices were detailed enough to expose financial discrepancies you'd hidden. You fabricated her disciplinary record, falsified a claim of excessive force, and most critically, you attempted to alter federal military service documents to justify her termination. That is a federal crime. Do you understand your rights?" The agent read Whitfield his rights. He heard the words like a man listening to his own verdict being read in a language he'd almost forgotten. Whitfield tried to speak, "This is a misunderstanding," but the younger agent cut him off with the precision of a surgical blade. "You fabricated disciplinary records. You attempted to alter federal military service documents. You knowingly filed fraudulent insurance claims." The agent placed handcuffs on the table. "Stand up." Whitfield stood. His hands went behind his back. The metal clicked around his wrists. The sound echoed in the silence like a judge's gavel. The walk out of the hospital happened in the late afternoon. Whitfield, handcuffed, was led through the corridors of Cedar Creek Medical with FBI agents on either side of him. Staff lined the hallways. Nurses he'd bullied stood in clusters, watching without expression. He passed the cafeteria where he'd knocked Brooke's tray to the floor 7 weeks earlier. He passed the lounge where he'd made his bet that she'd quit before the month ended. He passed the nursing station where she'd retrieved a chart from the floor without a word, without a flinch. His shoes echoed on the tile. Fluorescent lights tracked his movement. The doors to the parking lot opened, and federal vehicles waited like predators that had been hunting him the entire time. Brooke watched from the ICU window. Her son stood beside her, still in his ROTC uniform. Colonel Hayes was wheeled to the window by a nurse, and his hand found Brooke's shoulder, gripping it like an anchor. They watched Whitfield step into a federal vehicle. They watched the doors close. They watched the vehicle drive away. Hayes spoke quietly. "True class is what you do when the lights go out. You proved that in Bagram. You proved it here." Brooke didn't respond. Her eyes were on the empty parking space where the vehicle had been. Her son squeezed her hand. 6 months later, the hospital announced a new position, Director of ICU Operations at Cedar Creek Medical. The job was offered to Brooke personally, with formal apologies from the board, a settlement that covered lost wages and legal costs, and a promotion that came with an office on the 8th floor with windows looking out over Portland and the Columbia River beyond. She accepted. Her first day, she set up the office with the same meticulous care she brought to everything. A desk, 3 filing cabinets, a bookshelf for her nursing credentials and certifications. And on the top shelf, she placed the pair of worn combat boots. They were scuffed from years of deployment, from dust at Bagram, from landing zones and firefights and the kind of terrain that tests everything a person is made of. She placed them on the shelf beside her Master Chief Petty Officer insignia and a framed photograph, her son in his Naval Academy dress blues, accepted on Colonel Hayes's personal sponsorship. 1 year after Whitfield's conviction, someone told her he was selling cut-rate insurance from a folding table in a strip mall across the river. She didn't seek him out. Didn't need to. Some people dig themselves into holes deep enough that no additional effort is required. The young resident whose life she'd saved during the incident, the man whose head had been in the trajectory of the discharged veteran's weapon, appeared in her office doorway on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. He knocked lightly. She looked up from her charting. "We have a situation in the ICU." Brooke stood. Her hands were steady. She followed him down the corridor toward the surgical unit, and as she moved, the staff parted instinctively. They knew who she was now. Everyone knew. The story had spread through Cedar Creek Medical like muscle memory through a nervous system. The quiet nurse who'd been hiding in plain sight. The Master Chief Petty Officer who'd pushed a med cart while no one asked about her scars. In the ICU, a patient's oxygen saturation was dropping. The monitor showed 78% and falling. She moved to the bedside with precision, assessed the situation with a glance, endotracheal tube position suspected compromised, and called for a stat chest X-ray and an emergency reintubation setup. Her voice was calm. Her orders were absolute. No one questioned her. No one hesitated. The room moved like a choreographed dance because she moved like someone who understood that lives were currency and time was finite. The oxygen climbed. 85%. 91%. Stable. She stood back, watching the monitor trend, watching the color return to the patient's face, watching the small miracles that happen when someone who knows what they're doing is finally allowed to do it. Around her, nurses and residents and attending physicians worked without question. This was her ICU now. These were her people. And they had no idea, but they were beginning to understand exactly what they were working alongside. That evening, Brooke returned to her office. She stood at the window looking out over the city as it shifted into twilight. Somewhere across the river, Dr. Whitfield was still selling insurance from a folding table, still living in the particular isolation that comes from having destroyed yourself and being aware of it the entire time. She didn't feel anything about that. Not anger. Not satisfaction. Just the kind of distance that comes from having survived things he couldn't imagine. She looked at the combat boots on the shelf. She looked at her son's photograph. She looked at the office that had required her to survive 7 weeks of systematic humiliation without flinching, required her to disarm a man with a pistol in 4 seconds, required her to lose everything and then methodically reclaim it piece by piece. And finally, after all of it, she let herself smile. Not a broad smile. Not a celebratory one. Just the small, genuine smile of someone who'd spent a long time hiding and had finally decided to stop. The camera holds on the boots, worn, scuffed, polished, no longer hidden on a shelf in a dark closet but displayed where anyone who walked into that office could see them and understand that true strength is rarely announced. It whispers. It moves with precision. It saves lives. And it never, not once, requires validation from anyone else. Brooke's voice, steady and clear, comes through in the silence. True class is what you do when the lights go out. If you've made it this far, you already know what kind of person you're standing next to. Subscribe for more stories of the people who carry their scars in silence until the moment they finally don't have to anymore. Like this video if you've ever been underestimated. Comment below, what would you have done in Brooke's position? And follow us for more stories from the Code Whisperers. The people the world overlooks are often the ones holding it together.